Maybe really quick introduction to myself and the company. After that, I would like to explain to you why we believe that this topic could or should hopefully be interesting to you. Then give an example how transforming this function really doesn't work. An example which I experienced myself, learned a lot from it. And then give some ideas how we usually manage those things. So my name's Martin Göring. First of all, thank you very much for having me and giving the introduction. I'm the managing director of Lowendalmasai in Central Europe, which is the German-speaking part and the Benelux. And I support my colleague from the UK office in all matters regarding the purchasing offering that we have in our portfolio. Real quick regarding the company, I promised it's not going to be a sales pitch, so it's the only slide on us. After that, it's all on the topic. Lowendalmasai is actually a French firm. We're in business a little bit more than 20 years. And this is also, well, leading into the question why we believe that we know a thing or two about transforming functions, transforming businesses. Because we started out, the guys who started the firm 20 years ago started out doing operational improvements for companies. So it started with VAT-related issues, it started with purchasing-related issues. So naturally, they changed things within the firms and got a variable fee on that. So very quickly after that, the clients also said, well, but we also would like to enable our people to follow through with the improvements that you showed us, how you can do it on an operational project basis. So we developed approaches and tools how to help companies to improve these functions. So today, we're roughly 400 people, and we basically deal with everything that has to do with cost and cash in a company. So usually CFOs like us, and we do that in a very implementation-driven fashion. So why did we say, okay, let's talk about purchasing today? I mean, it's a function, you all know it, you all probably have it, but and you will probably be able to tell during the presentation, I get really excited about it because this is where I started my career. It's incredibly powerful when it comes to improving the performance of a business. If in this case, hypothetically, 50% of the revenue of the business is cost of materials, which is an industry average. So some production companies have 60, 70, 80%. Some service businesses have a little bit less. But if you assume you have 50% of your revenue as a purchasing volume going out to your supply chain again, and you're in some companies are doing good, some companies are doing not so good, but if you're doing in a not so great situation right now and you're in the profit margin area of 2%, if you would reduce your spend by 4%, if you would achieve a 4% cost reduction on your purchasing spend, what would happen to your result, to your performance, would mean that you would double your EBIT. So this is, and 4% is not that hard to do. However, doubling sales, which would have the same effect on your EBIT, is much harder, especially since many companies are much more mature when it comes to their salespeople, to their finance functions. The smart people often are in these functions. This is where a lot of people have, a lot of companies have invested a lot of trainings and so on and so forth. On the procurement side of things, sometimes still has some room for improvement. So obviously, if you're in a higher margin business, the effect gets a bit lower. But however, even if you're at an 8% EBIT margin, and you just reduce your cost by the same 4%, it's still 25% increase in EBIT. So it is something where we believe that people really, really should pay attention to. However, many, many firms, especially growing firms, obviously start working on their products, working on their sales, working on their revenues, work on their top lines. Well, this is a really, really nice way to work on the bottom line as well. So today what we see is, if we look at the procurement function, and I say function, not department, for a reason, a lot of companies are still in a very early stage of maturity. These are some examples. It's not really a linear function, but it helps to understand the development and the number of steps it takes to really become well, world class at this function. But in a lot of companies that we've seen in the past, especially small, medium companies, purchasing department, procurement department, those are the guys with the phones who do the ordering, so to speak. So this is nowhere near the strategic capabilities that it could have, or as we believe, should have. So from there, it's a quite long way to go, training people, educating people, but also training the organization, making sure that you can have the most brilliant purchasing person in your purchasing department. But if the engineering department doesn't involve this person early on in their new developments, this person will never really deliver the results he or she could. So it's one thing to train those people. It's another thing to write beautiful flowcharts and big books on processes and things. And it's an entirely different thing to bring this to life and to really make sure that this usually minimum half of the revenue spent that is going out of your company is managed properly, and that you don't spend money that you don't have to. So what I would like to start with is an example of how it shouldn't really be done. And this is a story I experienced myself. I spent basically my entire professional life in consulting firms. I started out in in-house consulting at Siemens, and then worked for several smaller boutiques, always focusing on the supply chain function, supply chain management function. And then when my back then fiancée, now wife, got pregnant for the first time, I said, okay, now it's time to get a proper job. Okay, so I moved into industry. And I found this wonderful job on paper at a very large industrial group where I was meant to look after their procurement strategy and their organizational development. So when I arrived, this group was at a very interesting point because they were 2 billion, roughly 2 billion euro in revenue, a little bit less maybe, a little bit more than 1 billion euro in spend, spread across 40 production sites. But those 40 production sites, in fact, were 40 small companies. They were very, very decentralized. The local MD was an entrepreneur. He had his local finance team, he has his local sales force. They were incredibly successful doing that. They have been so for decades. They grew, and a lot of the small firms, they were market leaders in a very small niche, somewhere like 15 million, 12 million euros in revenue. The biggest one was around 100 million. And they were really, really extremely successful. But then top management decided, well, what would make us even more successful is if we forget all this decentralized thing and we introduce the matrix. And now we have a matrix organization and we centralize things and we get synergies. And one of the big ideas was to get synergies from procurement, because if you buy more of a thing, you usually get it cheaper. So that was the plan. And then they said, okay, in order to do that, let's introduce a really, really great thing, e-procurement. Everybody talks about it. So they decide, okay, let's do e-procurement. Let's roll it out across all our 40 sites, because this will then allow us to have complete transparency of what people are doing, and then we can bundle this and pool this and tell them in the future you need to buy over here and then you need to do that, and we will have full control of things. Because challenge was we have 40 sites, 40 companies which are autonomous. So we have 40 completely different worlds when it comes to data, when it comes to suppliers. You have Smith and Sons, and you have Smith and Sons Limited. It's all the same company, but nobody knows because the data doesn't allow you. So the idea was, hey, let's go approach this and do this. And then they had a really, really, really clever idea. And they said, you, Mr. Junior Purchaser, he was a really smart young guy, you managed the rollout. And I mean, I probably wouldn't have to go further than that. And I mean, it was about 5 minutes after that was the time when I arrived. So I had a front row seat and the, well, not real pleasure to watch what happened next. And then I spent about 2 years trying to repair most of the damage that happened. Because for the local purchasing departments, I mean, you're a purchasing manager somewhere in a small local firm, very successful, and suddenly somebody introduces this new software and asks you to standardize all your data and so on and so forth. So for them, it didn't really add any benefit. So for them, it was basically only extra work. But, well, they turned to the only people they reported to, because they were used to have the local management, which decided things, which were basically entrepreneurs. And the local management said, well, yeah, why? Why should I do that? I'm making 25% EBIT, and now somebody from Düsseldorf, which is where I'm coming from today, by the way, is deciding that I should have this software. So, okay, this would have been something that you might have been able to manage, explaining people, we're all in the same boat and so on and so forth. But then they had also made a mistake. They selected the software, well, they knew it ran in one or two of the local German firms, but it was really poorly localized. So basically, they translated the French interface while introducing it in France. They didn't have anything in Spanish, so they worked on that while introducing it. But so people really weren't happy about that, spending their time being treated as lab rats. And so the result was, not only did this rollout fail miserably, but the entire idea of having a centralized procurement function and getting synergies from that and involving the central guys in development decisions and so on, the idea went up in flames. For years, it was basically ruined. So we worked real hard in getting people back on board, forgetting the big approach, but having a very, very personal approach to these things. But it took a lot of effort, and the reason is that this transformation, this evolvement was managed rather poorly. So what we see in our projects, or what we like to use when we talk to companies, and a lot of the companies are companies that have been successful in the past, have grown rapidly, and now suddenly are confronted with a level of complexity that they weren't used to in the past. But since they were growing so fast, they didn't really have the time to get processes in place, to get systems in place that would allow them to handle this complexity right now. My favorite example of that is the world's largest pretzel producer, Pretzel Bakery, started as a little bakery in the old city center of the town, and now is doing 150, 160 million in revenue. So, I mean, you need to sell a lot of pretzels to get there, and they have around 300, 400 employees. And they did that within 30 or 40 years. So every year they really, really grew like crazy. And somehow the purchasing department managed that growth, so they still get all their product in, but there's no way they do it in a really cost-efficient way. But so if you want to change that, one way would be to tell some junior guy to roll out a solution. What we prefer, and I'm not sure if this really translates into English, a lighthouse approach. So to build this one example that really shines and that shows people, okay, actually, it's not that bad an idea. It may not affect me immediately directly, but I can relate to that. I understand why people would think this is a clever thing to do. So what we usually do in this field, or in this case, is that we start from a project organization and then slowly transfer and transform it into a process organization. What does that mean? So you start by focusing on some key aspects of the future organizational setup. For example, if we talk about purchasing, I come from this field, but I'm pretty sure it translates to many other transformational areas. In the purchasing case, what we usually pick is category management. Category management is something that makes a lot of sense. So we pick this and do an exercise on one category, let it be stamping parts or cast iron parts or whatever. And we really, really follow through with the entire set of levers that we have at our disposal as purchasing professionals. So what we internally differentiate are commercial levers, organizational levers, technical levers. So commercial levers, what you know as purchasing, pooling, negotiating, things like that. organizational levers, how does the demand, how is it funneled through the organization so that the purchasers can really get a grip on it. And then technical levers, well, we basically challenge the specification. So for an example, for a large aircraft producer, we changed the material of the inlet lip of their turbine. They're still flying. But by doing that, we took out 40% of the cost of this part, which is something which is really hard to do through negotiations. So those are the sets of levers that the purchasers can, if they are involved in the process, apply to these things. So we do all this for one aspect, for one category, and this basically is then used as a proof of concept because it shows, and the results are dramatic. I mean, as I said, 40% is well, it's not always 40%, but I'm very confident that in most cases, everything between 10 to 25%, if there has not been a proper procurement strategic approach to a cost category, is a realistic target to reduce costs. And once you do that, you show also to key stakeholders, well, actually it's worth investing some time. And it becomes very hard for people to say, no, I really don't have time for that. It's really not something that's interesting for us. And the outcomes of this could, for example, be that you reduce prices or you have a consolidated supplier base so that the stakeholders are directly affected because they don't have to deal with so many different people. Instead of 12, you talk to 3 people. That's wonderful for everybody who's involved in that process. Or you make things faster because suddenly you have an outline agreement in place and you know exactly what things are going to cost instead of today where you need one hammer and the purchasing department starts calling people and getting quotes for hammers. And so you make sure that the organization understands the benefit of this. And then what we usually do is we try to perpetuate. Again, one of the words where I'm not sure if I translated that correctly. These project steps, because doing this little key function, you follow a certain level of steps. And these steps, they are really not that, well, not crazy rocket science. It's a really structured approach how to do these things. And you translate this into the possible daily business of everybody involved in this functional area. And you make sure, obviously, that the people understand what you're talking about. I mentioned, I met in one of those training sessions, we did a very basic training on Excel. So what's a lookup function? What's a pivot table? And then one of the purchasing guys says, well, I'm a purchaser, I'm not an accountant. I don't need that. I say, well, honestly, you're neither. Because these really basic things, you need to embrace the tools and to learn these things. So these trainings play an important role on making sure that the impact that you created once can then be replicated by the operational teams that are supposed to do this daily. And then you build the structure around this, and you do this very carefully because I'm pretty sure that this afternoon we could here on Flipchart draft all the purchasing processes any of your companies need, but those processes would never make it out of the room. It would be exactly the same example as in the failed e-procurement implementation earlier. It would be our processes and not the processes of the organization. So this is a process. The drafting and implementing these processes is actually a process itself. So, and to manage the people to the point where basically they draw up the process that you had in mind from the beginning. And then you can start to bring it alive. And then very important to measure what happened or what happens with brilliant ideas that you had, and to make sure if they really come to life, and if not, where you might want to fine-tune a little bit. So I think I need to speed up a little bit, but one structured approach on doing these things, and now I must admit it's basically the second slightly salesy slide in the deck. But for one of our clients, we developed this, we called it the Purchasing Maturity Program, short PUMP, which I liked a lot because the client was doing vacuum pumps. So it was a really bad joke, but I enjoy it. So what we did there is, because the challenge is, if you want to transform the function and you want to educate your people, if you send them to trainings, they will probably not do anything different from before after that training, because standard classroom training, it doesn't really apply to you. Plus, if you're just being told how to do these things, if you tell somebody how to build an RFQ pricing grid and to evaluate things, they grasp it, but they forget it. So the best thing is to make them actually do this. So that then they remember. So what we did in this program is we had 3 modules. We call it Find the Money, Get the Money, and Keep the Money. Find the Money was, how do I analyze a category which I have in front of me to identify where could I improve things and how much of savings would be realistic. And we would have a classroom training with the purchasers, but tailored to their company's needs. And then they would have a little coaching project, something that was small enough to do besides their daily job, because you mustn't forget that somehow the company needs to keep running, even if you transform it. And we would coach them, so they would go back, get one of their smaller categories and really start to analyze it. How do they find the data? How do they cleanse the data? How do they structure the data? All these things. And then they would come back, present this little pet project, and we would go to the next stage of classroom trainings, explaining to them, okay, now the next step, you know what you're going to do, how are you going to do it in real life. So, and then back to the coaching project, and then the last one, the Keep the Money bit, is where you bring in also the stakeholders in order to make sure that the organization understands what value those now brilliantly educated purchasing people can add to the company. Now, and in this case, because it was a large company and their maturity was rather low, there was a lot of potential to be gained. So in parallel, our teams did the job for them once. So they established a status quo, getting the cost performance to a level which was good and adequate. And then the guys could take over and manage it from there. Now the beauty was, since the team that gave the trainings and the team that delivered the project was the same team, and we did the trainings off-site, and they had a lot of, well, not a lot, they had some beers, a lot of, in the evening, so they knew each other, they trusted each other. The clients' teams understood why it is that those crazy guys with the headset and a trolley behind them are asking for this and this information. And so it was a very, very symbiotic and good experience. So 3.5 minutes longer than I promised. Do you have any questions? We still have 6.5 minutes for questions. But I'm willing to go longer than that. They need to drag me down from here. No questions.
What would you say the top 3 points for a finance director to think about when they are about to engage in a procurement project?
Well, there are a lot of points to think about, and picking the top 3 is not that easy. I think one key thing is the idea behind the Lighthouse approach is that you actually show the people the actual value that is in there. So you do it once, and so when you engage in such a project, and I will take the liberty to say you will probably want to take a consultant on board. Make sure this consultant is not your, well, the typical strategy consultant can help you a lot, can tell you exactly you should really pool the demands, and then you can save money, and you should roll out e-procurement solutions, and you should introduce the matrix organization. But if you go for external support, make sure it's somebody who knows the practical sides of things and can follow through with this Lighthouse approach, in the sense of get their hands dirty and do it with your people for them. Because otherwise you will always have this not invented here syndrome. There's somebody from the outside coming and telling me what to do. I really don't like that. And it wasn't my idea in the first place, so probably it's a bad idea. So getting somebody in there who does it for you helps a lot. This would be number 1. Number 2, if you engage in such a project, absolutely necessary. Management has to stand behind this, because there will be in the beginning, also with the most brilliant Lighthouse initiative, there will be some resistance. And this resistance will only be overcome if management very clearly announces, this is our idea, we want this, we really need to do this, this is the opportunity that lies behind this. And the third thing would probably be, so take the right consultants, management needs to be behind this, and, well, you want to make sure to explain and to take the time to explain to people why it is that you do. Because biggest fear, purchasing department, if this project finds some savings, this means I did a poor job in the past. Well, if you think back to the pretzel bakery, there's a lot of savings there, but it was a two-guy department. They managed the transition from a 5 million company to a 150 million company. This is pretty impressive. So if we find a lot of savings there, it doesn't mean they did a bad job. It means they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the structures to do to get the impact that they could have doing a good job, as they did under different circumstances. Okay, I hope the last sentence didn't kill the entire answer. Further questions?
Yep. How do you factor in service and quality? We've been in the situation before where a group is saying, make savings, and actually I'd rather pay a bit more and make sure we had a guaranteed quality service.
Yeah, that's actually one of the key challenges that you need to tackle very in the beginning of the entire project, defining what is it really that we want to have. An example, last year we finished a project for a large financial service provider. What they do is they handle your card payments, everything that happens between you put your card in the cash machine at the supermarket, the money disappears from your account. So they're basically an IT company. They have big data centers that they operate, and they really can't take any risks on quality. So their biggest fear was, okay, so now purchasing comes in, and they slash quality. And then on a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks before Christmas, in the supermarket, the payment cash-out systems break down, and then we're dead, because those clients, they serve 9 of the 10 biggest retailers in Germany, and so those guys don't fool around. So what we did was we approached it with the IT team, who was obviously incentivized to have the most secure system they could have. They didn't really care about cost. This is why management brought us in the first place. And what we did then was we broke down their technical specification, because especially if you talk about IT, it's very difficult to approach investment topics in the traditional purchasing way of creating competition, write a big tender, and because if the guy says, I need a Cisco component, well, there are not so many manufacturers of Cisco components out there. So you're very often in a monopoly situation where you're facing them. So what we did is we brought in one of our IT experts, and he sat down with them, and they broke up this technical specification, which basically is, I need this HP Super Flash 5000 Thunderbolt, whatever, and I need 5 of these, into, okay, what's the need that needs to be satisfied? What's the functional specification? And in this case, it was a backup solution. So they are having 2 data centers. They are linked with dark fiber networks, and they are highly encrypted because there's 60 billion euros of really tiny transactions going through them every year. And you need to store all this data and to be able to, on Saturday afternoon, if it breaks down, to be back online as fast as possible. So it's a serious piece of equipment with duplication and things I barely understand. I went to business school. I have no idea of those things. So it was a 1 million euro investment. Then the CFO already did some cost savings himself. He cut the budget by 20%. So it was an 800,000 euros investment. And then what we did, we broke down the technical specification, because they already had in mind what would be the perfect solution for them. It was what they had used before. It was what they knew. And we transformed it into a functional one. And this allowed us to go to the market and to ask all the solution providers, what's your approach on solving this problem? this challenge that we have here. But please keep in mind, this, and these are the quality requirements that come on top of this. And the result was that we came to a completely different solution than they had in mind previously. The solution served and solved their issues 100%. Actually, they had much more storage than they had usually planned. And it was 53 or 57, I don't remember. 57% below budget. Now, this client is, I can guarantee you, there's not many clients who will be more risk averse than those guys, because there's a lot of money riding on the quality of their IT equipment. And this effect, again, I'm not saying 50% is something that you can easily get, and it was a lengthy process. Breaking down the specification into a functional one was a lot of work. But this is possible, but in order to make sure that quality in the end isn't compromised, you have to start at the very beginning when you define what is it that you actually procure, and in order to define what's possible, what levers can you use and what's not possible. What are things where you can compromise, what are things that you really can't compromise. I think now I'm...
Thank you, Martin. That was really interesting.